But first up on the phone-in is now the time to start planning for indyref2. 08085 92 95 00.
Your calls, your stories.
Mornings with Kaye Adams on BBC Radio Scotland.
So Nicola Sturgeon was interviewed on the BBC yesterday and said the preparatory work to bring forward legislation for another independence referendum was underway, with the intention of holding it before the end of next year, 2023. The Scottish Conservatives have branded it reckless. The Chief Executive of Scotland in the Union said it was out of touch, and the Scottish Liberal Democrats urged the First Minister to focus instead on climate, health, young people and business rather than another independence referendum. Nicola Sturgeon says it would give a chance for Scots to get away from the chaotic instability of Westminster. So over to you. 08085 92 95 00 is the number to call. Do you think this is the time to start planning for indyref2? If you look at the timeline of the last referendum in 2014, it would probably mean, if it was to go along the same kind of schedule, campaigning ramping up from early summer, this summer, of course. Does that give us enough bandwidth, do you think, to concentrate on pandemic recovery? Or do you see it as essential to pandemic recovery? You can text us on 80295, standard messaging rates apply. Email k@bbc.co.uk. Some of the texts coming in. Donny says, yep, it is the time. Look at the mess the UK is in now, and we didn't want Brexit. Carol's on Facebook saying, John Swinney on Radio Scotland saying recovery is on the way because unemployment is down in Scotland. Is he seriously saying this recovery is down to policies adopted by the SNP? They want to take us back into the EU with no control over the numbers coming here. Increased pressure on hospitals, doctors, surgeries, housing, roads and everything else that uncontrolled immigration causes. Supposedly they're following a sustainable future for Scotland. Freedom, she said, D-U-M-B on the end. Ooh, that's a bit inflammatory. I was hoping for a nice calm hour. Maybe that's not going to happen. In terms of holding a second independence referendum and the timing of it, has the pandemic shaped your view? And in what way has it shaped that view? Does the end of 2023 sound about right to you for a second independence referendum, another independence referendum? Of course, it was part of the SNP's manifesto, and we do have a majority number of MSPs in the Scottish Parliament who are pro-independence. Maybe you would like to see it even sooner than the end of 2023. There are those, of course, who don't want to see it at all. Give us a call. 08085 92 95 00 is the number. Is now the time to be planning for indyref2. We are joined this morning by Blair Jenkins, who, of course, is Chief Executive of the Yes campaign in the 2014 referendum. Good morning to you, Blair.
Hi, Kaye. Good morning.
Good morning. We're also joined by Mary Scanlon, from Scottish Conservatives, former MSP. Good morning to you, Mary.
Good morning.
Good morning. So, Blair, do you think this is the time to be planning for indyref2?
Well, there's no doubt there's a very clear democratic mandate to hold a new referendum, and I guess the question here is not so much, it's not one of principle, because the principle is clear. We're going to be having a new referendum. There is an issue around timing. I think even her political opponents would agree that Nicola Sturgeon's taken a very cautious view of how we get through this pandemic and how we come out of the other side of it. So there'd be no question of holding a referendum at a point when it was unsafe to do so, or when we couldn't have the kind of campaigning and the kind of conversation nationally that we had for the 2014 referendum. So I think the next year looks like the right time. I'm open to discussion about exactly what point in the year, spring or autumn or whatever, is going to be held. But people should be in no doubt. There is no argument. There is no democratic argument against holding a new referendum. If there is, then I'd like people to point it out to me. If they've heard it somewhere or seen it in a newspaper, or if it's written on a wall somewhere, then someone should point it out, because it seems to me, and I think to most fair-minded people, that the Scottish Parliament has a clear mandate to hold a new referendum, and unless we're in the business now in the UK of obstructing democracy, then that has to happen. OK, well, we kind of thought we'd be talking about timing this morning, but since you raise it, Mary, would you accept that this is a discussion about timing, but there's no question that there should indeed be indyref2?
Well, I think you're find, although I'm retired from the Parliament, I still follow politics closely. And I think you'll find that independence was not at the top of the agenda for most of the people who voted SNP. But nonetheless...
How did you get to that conclusion, Mary?
That was all the polling that was done. It tended to be things like NHS. It tended to be worried about the pandemic, worried about education, business, Brexit, all sorts of things. But it wasn't always the number one issue. But nonetheless, the SNP do have the majority, and it was a manifesto commitment. But I think the one thing we should be talking about, Scotland is in a very, very different place to what we were in September 2014. The SNP have to argue not just about being independent or separating from Westminster. They've got to argue about taking us back into Europe. And I don't know how many people may want independence, but do they really want to be totally controlled by Europe? We still don't know what the currency should be. And I don't know about UK, but I've got plenty of friends that are being told to wait about 6 years to get a hip operation. So I think that Nicola should be forgetting about taking steps on the referendum and looking at education, because there's been a huge loss there, and also the NHS. And, the SNP do have a strong voice at Westminster.
Well, Mary, let me just bring in Blair again, and then I'm going to go to the calls, because the calls are already stacking up here, and I really want to get a feeling from people who are listening this morning whether they think the time is right. 08085 92 95 00. Blair, as Mary Scanlon says, immediately you come back to all of the arguments. You're talking about Brexit, whether you want to be in, whether you want to be out, whether you want to revisit that. You're talking about currency, all the stuff that we became very familiar with, or we have become very familiar with over the past 7 years now. Is this the time, when we are hoping to recover from a pandemic, but we don't even have certainty that we are coming out of this pandemic? As you say, Nicola Sturgeon has been very cautious. She has said that she believes us to be on the downward slope, but nobody is in a position to say, hey, it's over. There are so many issues arising as a result of the pandemic. Is this the time to be putting our energies into an independence referendum and the campaigning? You said perhaps spring 2023, perhaps autumn. If we look at 2014, the referendum was held in September. The launch of the Yes Scotland campaign, which you yourself were the chief executive of, started in May of the previous year, 2012. So you'd be talking about this ramping up, if we were going to have it in 2023, within the next couple of months. Is that really where we should be focusing?
Well, one of the key things to say about the new referendum that's coming is, of course, it will be a much shorter campaign than it was last time. Last time, everybody was really starting from scratch, and it took a long time to get people into the detail of the arguments. We would start from a position now where this is a pretty mature and sophisticated debate in Scotland, and most people understand what it's about. So this would be a much shorter campaign.
Really? Is it not completely different? We have Brexit, we're outside Europe, we were inside Europe at that time. We were talking about oil being a major resource for Scotland going forward in 2014. We're not talking about that anymore. So, it's a different referendum.
It's definitely a different referendum. It's a new referendum. It's not the same as the previous one. But I can assure you, as someone who was immersed in this, as you say, right throughout the last referendum, that we start this time from a much higher level of public knowledge about the ins and outs of independence. But the point about this, I think, is, now I take on board some of what Mary said, but, democracy doesn't come to a halt. And Scotland can't stay in a state of suspended animation on this issue. I would accept that the new referendum will probably start from a position where the opinion in Scotland is probably now fairly evenly divided on this. My own belief, I have no guarantee of this. I believe that when we have the arguments, as happened in 2014, the ground moves towards yes. We saw a pretty sizable shift in the course of 2012 to 2014 towards the yes case. The week I was appointed, there's one poll came out which didn't encourage me hugely that week, which had support for independence at 27%. Now, we finished on 45%. I believe in a new referendum with, I think, the stronger arguments now for independence. I think we would win that. But, that can't be guaranteed, and we might lose it. I completely accept that. I also think, Kaye, you and I, we will both have friends, we will both have people we like and respect who have different views from our own on this issue. And that's absolutely fine. I think anyone who thinks that the people on the other side don't have a case to make really needs to get out more and talk to more people or stand back from the debate for a while. This is an issue on which I would quite accept decent and reasonable people have different views. I'm a strong supporter of Scotland being independent. But, I think anyone who believes that people on the other side of the argument are either, stupid or wicked or something like that, really needs to stand back and get a sense of perspective. We had a very good debate last time. I'm sure we'll have a very good debate this time. And I'll be quite happy for the people who oppose independence to make their case. But we got to have a referendum.
OK, all right. Well, let's hear from Paul in Glasgow and Michael in Edinburgh. I think Paul is not in favour of a referendum, so Blair, you can see what he says. And yes, can I echo your sentiments here? I think absolutely we can have a fair and reasonable and decent discussion about this. 08085 92 95 00. Do you think now is the time to start planning for a second referendum? Blair Jenkins there, Chief Executive of the 2014 Yes Scotland campaign, says we cannot remain in suspended animation. Clearly there is a manifesto commitment on the behalf of the SNP and indeed the Greens to have a referendum. We have to go ahead and have that. Do you agree? Is now the time? Would you like to see it being brought forward? And what would the timing be for you? And we have gone through the most extraordinary 2 years. Blair Jenkins saying that we have a more mature population now in terms of the discussion around independence, but much has changed, not least the pandemic. Have the past couple of years shaped your views in whatever direction? You can also text us on 80295, but please do pick up the phone 08085 92 95 00. Paul's in Glasgow. We've got Michael in Edinburgh too. Morning, Paul.
Good morning, Kaye.
Good morning. You hear what Blair says. We've got to have it. The government, Scottish Government, were elected on the basis that they would have it. So it's got to be sometime. Do you agree?
Absolutely not. I think the gentleman that you've got on the show this morning needs to lie down, put a wet towel over his head and take a couple of paracetamol. Okay. This is an absolute nonsense because our economy is on its knees. We talk about the pandemic. We had 4 separate administrations running the COVID recovery, etc. And you had all these different opinions, all these different people arguing. And here we go. We're just coming out of the pandemic, and the SNP are wheeling out the referendum to deflect 100% on the record within our country. Now, nobody in the SNP has ever once explained the business case for this. When people buy a house, they know they're getting 3 bedrooms, a bathroom, a roof, a garden, or whatever. The SNP have never explained to the Scottish people what we're getting as an independent country. We don't have the tax receipts to get us out of this mire without being part of the United Kingdom. And the United Kingdom finances, as well as the Scottish finances and the Welsh and Irish, etc., pulled us together to get out here. But this is an absolute deflect to the day job.
Yeah, but Paul, that would be part of the campaign, wouldn't it? You know, that would be part of the discussion that we would have in a run-up to a referendum. And Blair Jenkins has completely acknowledged that at the end of it, you know, it might be no. The answer might be no, but that the people have to have the opportunity to have that discussion and to have that vote.
We've had this discussion we had it up to 2014. People have got a sore head. They've got a sore head. They're sick of it.
Well, hang on. All right, Paul, stay with me. I want to see if Michael's got a sore head. Michael?
No, I don't have a sore head.
I'm glad to hear it.
And to give you good Edinburgh talk, I don't have a sore head either.
Oh, right. Sorry, Michael. Do apologise.
Well, I'm a scheme boy for Edinburgh, but I can talk 2 languages. I can talk sore heads and sore heads. Anyway, let's get on with it. I think we should be going for independence as soon as possible. I think I'll be very disappointed if Mr Johnson gets the bullet, because he's the greatest advert for independence. Regarding the finances of Scotland, we can't raise our money because we've got to wait on Mr Johnson and his ilk telling us, yes, you can have this and you can have that. And I'm fed up hearing Mr Johnson and his pals saying, what we have done for you. Well, that's why they're in government, to look after the people. And as far as Mr Rees-Mogg's comment last week, totally disrespectful to his own colleague. So if that's what he thinks of his own colleague, Mr Ross, what does he think about the Scottish people as a whole? Now, I've been interested in independence since mid to late 60s. I'm now in my mid-70s, and I go back to, I don't know if you remember the lady Wendy Wood.
I don't actually, sorry.
No, well, I used to go down to the foot of the mound on a Saturday evening to Speaker's Corner, the equivalent of Speaker's Corner. And Wendy stood there and spoke about independence for Scotland. So ever since then, I've been interested in it. And honest to God, Kaye, the sooner the better. And I hope I see it in my lifetime. As I say, I'm 3 or 4 years past my Bible allocation of 70 years. And I can only hope that we get it.
And now you think this is a good time then, Michael?
Yes.
Yep.
Well, given the performance of the UK government, I think now is the time to press ahead.
Okay.
And as far as financing, when we have access to the funds that the UK government have had, and then they start distributing to Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, dripping a bit of money here and taking it back there. Well, it's time. We're a nation of our own, and it's time we took things in hand and did it ourselves.
Well, Michael, you and Paul are on opposite sides of this discussion. That's the discussion we're looking to have this morning. Do you think now is the time for a second independence referendum? We could talk about the timing, but how do you feel about the absolute legitimacy, it's probably the wrong word, but I mean, what Blair Jenkins is saying, Chief Executive of the Yes Scotland campaign in 2014, is that we have a government that was elected on the basis of a manifesto commitment for a second independence referendum. And therefore, that has to be followed through on. We have to have this referendum. You can debate the timing, and we will, of course, debate the issues in the run-up to that referendum if and when it does happen. And the result will be what the result is. But we have to lance that boil. We have to have indyref2. Do you accept that premise? And if so, when? When is the right time? Is now the right time? We are hopefully on the downslope of the pandemic, according to not just Nicola Sturgeon, but many other people. We all keep our fingers crossed, of course, that is the case. No one has a crystal ball on that one. There is much to try and recover from in terms of the pandemic. Do you see this the right time to be ramping up to indyref2? Or indeed, you might think it's absolutely essential that we are ramping up to indyref2 so that any recovery from the pandemic is geared by a government in Holyrood rather than a government in Westminster, which Nicola Sturgeon would say is characterised by chaotic instability. 08085 92 95 00. Pick up the phone, tell us what you think. John's in East Kilbride. We'll speak to him next. John in East Kilbride, is now the time for indyref2?
Good morning, Kaye.
Good morning.
No, it is not. And this is coming from a person. I've been on your show numerous times before on various subjects, also about independence as well. I was an ardent supporter of independence in 2014. I voted yes. I voted yes with pride. We lost. You can say things have changed. They haven't. It was a free, open, free and fair referendum. We lost. I was gutted we lost. But that's democracy. People coming on and listening to some of your other texts and what you say, it's democracy. We've elected in two parties that were on a promise of a referendum. So we just ignore the democracy of 2014. We were promised.
Well, we've still got Blair Jenkins with us, Chief Executive of the Yes Scotland campaign in 2014. Blair, would you like to respond to John?
Yeah, I can do it because it's something that you hear people say from time to time. But the thing about this, I think, John, is democracy is not a one-off event. The people who oppose independence have been saying ever since the first referendum. And they can make the case. You said it was a once-in-a-generation thing, etc., etc. But the point about this is it's not up to politicians, certainly not up to me, to decide when there should be a second referendum. It's up to the people. The general election in Scotland last year, in May of last year, was fought largely on the single issue of should there be a second independence referendum. The main opposition party, Mary's party, Conservative Party, everything that came through my door from the Tory party said the SNP are going to hold another independence referendum if they win. Vote for us so they can't do it. Now, if democracy means anything, that was a fair and free election. We had the highest turnout we've ever had in an election in Scotland. The SNP went from holding 80% of the constituencies in Scotland to 85%. They got the record number of votes for a political party. The share of the vote went up. It's a higher share of the vote than the Conservatives or Labour have managed in a UK election in the last 50 years, higher than Tony Blair or Margaret Thatcher ever achieved. We now have the highest pro-referendum majority, the biggest pro-referendum majority in the Scottish Parliament that we've ever had. I mean, really, if democracy means anything, then it's not just that a new referendum is the right thing to happen. It's the only thing that can happen.
John?
Mr. Jenkins, I'm sorry. You missed my whole point entirely. Alex Salmond, with Nicola Sturgeon at the side of her, said it's a once-in-a-generation.
I think I addressed
now,
that point.
I'm gutted, Hold on, Mr. Jenkins. I'm absolutely gutted we lost. And I'm also gutted that we lost. I voted to remain in Europe at the Brexit. It's democracy. You win some, you lose some. We have only gone past how many years? Is it 8 years? Yes?
Yeah, no, you're right. It's 2014,
no,
that's right, yeah.
Past 8 years since independence referendum, if my arithmetic is correct, we'll be coming up for the 8-year mark.
Uh-huh.
Now, that is not anywhere remotely close to a generation. If my understanding of a legal definition of a generation is, and I'm willing to be corrected, 25 years.
John, I'm just thinking, if let's say in the Westminster election, the next government was a Labour government, let's just say that, and they decided that they were going to have another referendum on Europe and rerun that one.
Yes.
Would you support that?
I couldn't support it on the same argument that I was using for this one. And I had this discussion with my girlfriend last night. I couldn't support it because we had the vote, we lost.
Right.
But if the Labour come and do that, it would be an affront to democracy, just the same way that the SNP are trying to put this. Now, another subject, just quickly on it, all in the same thing. You had a caller on immediately after Blair Jenkins there, who was also against it. And he was against it because he highlighted a terrific point that I have to be honest with you, Kaye, I've got my hands full here. I've been in and out of the show all morning. The SNP are using this as a deflection. I have really lost faith in Nicola Sturgeon and her husband Peter Murrell. I really have. And I think the people of Scotland need to wake up.
Well, he's not an elected official.
I know that, but he has. Yeah, I get that. Yes, but he has influence, and that was proven during the Alex Salmond inquiry. Now, listen, okay, this government have failed drastically on education. And do you remember Nicola Sturgeon's famous thing? Judge me on education. And the highlight of that, if you're looking for a perfect example, the Ofsted report was given to the SNP 6 months before the last Scottish elections. They kept it, they didn't reveal it. They moved John Swinney out of education, put him into the Deputy First Minister's office, put the new woman in, and as soon as the election was over, they released the Ofsted report, which criticised them to all hell, and John Swinney deflected.
Yeah, I mean, John,
different to Labour and the Tories.
You have clearly become very disenchanted by the government, and it has caused you to change your vote from yes to no. But I just read out a text there earlier from Margaret saying that she's gone the other way, that she voted no in 2014, and that actually the performance of the Westminster government, what she sees as incompetence and corruption, is dragging us down, and therefore she does want another independence referendum, and she would vote yes. And I'm only saying that to, I guess, go back to Blair's point about whether or not democracy is a moment in time and whether or not you can absolutely stick to the once in a generation, whatever we say that is, or you have to respond to events and changing circumstances. And my goodness, 2022 is a very, very, very different year from 2014. I don't think anyone could argue about that. 08085 92 95 00 is the number to call. Is it the right time to start planning for another independence referendum? Do we have to start planning for another independence referendum, given that the Scottish Government, as currently sits, was elected on that promise of holding another independence referendum in the next Parliament? John's in Kirkintilloch. Good morning, John.
Morning, Kate. Thanks for having me. Yes, we should definitely have it. and it's definitely a democracy issue. Just listening to your last caller, Nicola, much as I respect Nicola, she doesn't decide these things. It's the Scottish electorate, it's the Scottish people. She said it was once in a generation. That's not her decision. Ever since then, Scottish government, the SNP, have won election after election. The last election, indyref2 was topmost one of their priorities in their manifesto. And the SNP ended up getting 48% of the vote. We hear from Westminster, I hear it all the time, that Boris Johnson won a massive majority, won hands down in the last general election. He got 40% of the vote. And that's normal for a Westminster election to have a massive majority. The SNP up here, under a really democratic system, got 48% of the vote.
Yeah.
So nobody can argue against
It is a different electoral system.
You're arguing against democracy itself.
Yeah, it is a different electoral system, isn't it? First past the post in Westminster. And what's the technical term for what we have, Blair?
Well, the technical term is proportional. It's proportional representation, but it's actually a very good point to make.
It's not supposed to deliver a majority government.
It's not supposed to. And the interesting thing is, if you think of all...
Sorry, John, I'll just let Blair finish his point and come back to you. Go on, Blair.
It's just to say, just to echo John's point, if the Scottish elections were conducted under the Westminster model, the SNP would have won 550 of the 650 seats at Westminster. So if we just had first past to the post up here, there'd be a majority for the SNP in the Scottish Parliament, the likes of which has never been achieved at Westminster.
It's another question to throw out to our listeners, actually, because a couple of people have alluded to it in terms of the huge majority, as you say, Blair. Were you voting, if you voted last time for the SNP, were you voting for another independence referendum? How high up on your priority list was that? It was crystal clear, clearly, that it was a major issue. Mary Scanlon, former Conservative MSP, says that she doesn't believe that was the top priority of many SNP voters last time. So it would be very interesting to hear from you this morning if it was very much top of your list in terms of why you voted SNP. 08085 92 95 00. John, I'll just let you finish off your point, and then I've got Sally and Ali coming in. Good morning. Well, I'll bring them in a tick. John, if you want to finish your point.
Thanks. I was just going to say the same as Blair, but can I also point out that Northern Ireland, it's under the Northern Ireland Agreement agreed by unionist parties. Northern Ireland can have a referendum every 7 years. That's what they consider a suitable time on it if the Northern Irish Parliament votes for it. So I think that's unarguable.
Mm-hmm. And John, just one final thing then. You would be quite happy for an independence referendum campaign, which would probably have to start in the next few months, to be running concurrently with pandemic recovery. You don't see those two as taking from each other?
No, definitely not. And when you think Scotland sends 70% of its revenues down to Westminster for Westminster to give back, decide what it wants to give back to Scotland, we should be spending that money like every other European country, like Denmark, Sweden, Norway, Finland, on our own country, and not allowing others to make those decisions for us. OK,
John, listen, thank you very much indeed. Let's speak to Ali. Morning, Ali.
Morning.
Good morning. How are you this morning?
Yeah, I'm good, thanks. How's yourself?
I'm well. So, on timing of a second independence referendum and the necessity of a second independence referendum, what are your thoughts?
I think sort of the end of next year is doable. We've had a US election in the middle of the pandemic. We've had Brexit happen in the middle of the pandemic. I think as we go out of the pandemic, it could be definitely done.
Right, OK. And you're keen for it to be done, yeah?
Yeah, I think certain things during the pandemic have sort of displayed that to be in charge of your own affairs is important. I think a lot of the countries, the smaller countries in the world, have coped very well. I think there's a lot to be said for being in control of, particularly with regards to the pandemic, who can fly in and out of your country, who can come across your border. Have you got control of your finances? I mean, Scotland relies on fiscal transfers. That's not a sustainable way to conduct your economy.
Has the experience of the pandemic shaped your thoughts on independence at all, or have you always been pro-independence?
Generally, I've always been pro-independence, but I feel that the pandemic has sort of accentuated these things. I don't really see that it's made. I think
so it's kind of consolidated, if anything, your support for independence rather than the opposite. Yeah.
I would say so. I think that every government in the world can probably face criticisms with regards to the way they've conducted themselves. But I have to say, broadly, I've been in agreement with Scotland's more cautious approach.
Okay, thanks, Ali. Again, something I'd be really interested to hear from people on how much the experience of the last 2 years has shaped your views on independence for the future, whether it has changed it in either direction. But more broadly, want to hear about the timing, whether you think now is the time. 08085 92 95 00. Another question that's come up this morning as to whether or not, if you voted for the Scottish Nationalist Party, last time, was it really your principal consideration was another independence referendum? How high up on the list was that for you? We've had different views on that this morning. 08085 92 95 00. Loads of calls coming in, but let me just take a quick break to speak to Sir John Curtis, Professor of Politics at Strathclyde University, and as I'm sure you will know, expert on polling. Good morning to you, John.
Good morning to you, Kaye.
Good morning. How much do you think that the pandemic has had an influence on the way people are feeling re-independent?
Well, the truth is that over the long term, at least, it looks as though it's not made much difference to the balance of opinion. If we go back to the position in February 2020, just after the UK left the European Union, the opinion polls were saying 50% for yes, 50% for no. It did then rise in particularly the second half of 2020, beginning of 2021. And we did have the polls for a while on average, showing yes on 53-54%. The first time ever we'd consistently had polls saying that yes were ahead over a lengthy period of time. But that came back down again during last winter. And at the moment, at least, if you take the average of the last half dozen polls, we're again at yes 50%, no 50%. So there certainly was a feeling, and I think one would acknowledge this, that particularly as it were between the first and the second waves of the lockdown, that perhaps Nicola Sturgeon was felt to be handling things better, and that there was a group of no voters who said, well, maybe we would have handled this a wee bit better if we'd been independent. But the truth is that the polling evidence, such as we've got, suggests that mood dissipated 6 months later. And the pandemic, I'm sure we'll be arguing about the pandemic if we do get a referendum campaign, but it's not clear that that's proved to be decisive, at least so far as the balance of opinion is concerned.
So, I mean, if at the moment we're sitting at roughly 50-50, is that a good position for Nicola Sturgeon to be going into a second referendum? I mean, we heard from Blair Jenkins yesterday, who said that, yes, he thought it was, because when he was appointed as Chief Executive of the Yes Scotland campaign in 2014, the polling was much lower than that, and they pulled it up, as we know, to a very, very close position. So is that a nice position to be going into it as far as she's concerned, do you think?
No. But equally, it's not a nice position for Boris Johnson or whoever is the UK Prime Minister to be facing either. The truth is, the polls are essentially saying that where we stand at the moment, at least, the outcome of any referendum is we know no more better than if we were to toss a coin. We cannot assume that because the yes side won the campaign, if not necessarily the eventual outcome in 2014, that they will necessarily succeed in doing so a second time around. Indeed, I think we probably need to appreciate that given that many people made a clear decision 7 years ago, that shifting opinion is probably going to be more difficult in this campaign than last time. Now, I don't rule out the possibility that they will make progress, but equally I don't rule out the possibility that the Union side will make progress. The truth is, of course, is that one of the arguments in favour of having the referendum is that an awful lot of change has changed since 2014. And I think there's a lot of merit to that argument, that the choice that Scotland would face, particularly now that the United Kingdom is outside the European Union, is a markedly different one from the one that it had 7 years ago. But equally, the truth is we've not really had much debate about the merits or otherwise of independence in those new circumstances. And it's, I think, only when both sides have developed their arguments, have started to engage with other about those arguments, that we will get some sense of how people feel about independence when they hear what I think from both sides will be a rather different set of arguments than the ones they heard 7 years ago.
And then, of course, just in case I'm sure people are screaming at the radio, I have, of course, blithely ignored the fact that it is at the moment in Boris Johnson's gift as to whether or not there is a second referendum. And thus far he has said that he is not in favour of it.
Yes, that's true. Well, let's leave aside the current difficulties of the Prime Minister.
I should say in the office of the Prime Minister rather than Boris Johnson, should I?
Indeed, and I think we should certainly acknowledge that it's extremely unlikely that any Conservative Prime Minister is going to allow a referendum this side of, and I think this is where we need to be aware of the next UK general election. I suspect that, I mean, there are two avenues down which this story is likely to go, given the position of the UK government. One is that we will end up with, the Scottish Parliament passing some kind of legislation, and that all ends up in the courts, and that may be progressing what's really happening in 2023. The second thing, of course, is we do have to bear in mind that a UK general election will have to be held by the end of 2024. And let's put it like this, it is by no means inconceivable that we could end up with a hung parliament in which the SNP perhaps hold the balance of power. Now, if that is the situation, the truth is that the realpolitik of the position at Westminster will be very different from what it is with a UK government that is committed to the Union with an overall majority of 80. Now, I think the outcome of that scenario is very uncertain, but we should be aware that even if the current government is immovable, post a UK general election, the politics of holding a referendum may look very different.
Right, OK. John, thank you very much indeed. Professor Sir John Curtis there from Strathclyde University. Right, got loads of calls coming in. 08085 92 95 00. Lots to discuss. Is now the time to start planning for a second independence referendum? Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister, spoke to the BBC yesterday and said preparations are underway. She will do everything in her power, she says, and perhaps that phrase "in her power" is really key to this, to hold a second independence referendum by the end of 2023. And of course, if that were to go forward, and there are clearly obstructions to that Professor Sir John Curtis has just outlined, but if that were to go forward, then we would be starting to hear the arguments from sort of early summer. We would be back into campaigning mode by the early summer, and it would evolve from there. Is that what you would like to see? Do you think, as Blair Jenkins, Chief Executive of the Yes Scotland campaign, said earlier, this is a question of democracy? You have a government that has been elected, and one of its central tenets of its manifesto is that it would hold a second independence referendum by the end of its term, of the Parliament's term, and therefore we need to have a second independence referendum, regardless of what the outcome is. We need to have one. 08085 92 95 00. Text us on 80295. The principle of independence is undeniable, but how do we finance an independent Scotland? We're going back into the debates here from John from Glasgow here. About 20% of our population are still in full-time education, 20% are over 65. This indicates that 60% of the population will be required to support the rest of the country. With the demands on our health service a dangerous challenge and education standards also being questioned, do we really know what we can afford? UK invested in research to COVID medicine earlier than most nations, and independent Scotland would not have that sufficient financial power to do it. Scotland would have been slower to get the vaccine, and we would be in a worse situation. That's from Alistair Kelly. Alice in Aberdeen says, I voted yes in 2014. I'll do so again, but it doesn't mean the SNP is the right party to have overall power. Many things need to change, and independence is just the start. Quite a few people mentioning the pandemic there. How much of an influence has the last 2 years had on the way you feel about a future independence referendum? That would be good to hear too. Sheila's in Trinent. Good morning, Sheila.
Hello.
Hi, morning. What are your thoughts, Sheila?
Well, I was just thinking that in 2014, the independence referendum was lost by the SNP, but they did not accept that result. And ever since, they've been campaigning again for another referendum. Now, just supposing that they lose the next referendum, whenever that is, are we going to be back to square one and they start campaigning again and we have this divisive situation where we have more or less one half of the country wanting it and one half of the country not wanting it?
I take it you're in the half that doesn't want it.
I would want to know that we could be financially stable, and I don't think that has been proved at all. I think that...
But Sheila, would you not like to have the discussion and the debate? I mean, given that, so much has changed in the last 7 or 8 years, not least the oil situation, the pandemic, the fact that we're no longer Europe as part of the UK, so much has changed. Would you not like to have the debate afresh with all these new issues that are relevant, and thereafter have the vote and go with that vote?
Yes, I would like to have all that discussion because I think it's all these things have changed, as you correctly say, but I would like a guarantee that the SNP accept the result and move forward in that way, rather than starting another campaign, which in those circumstances would clearly be against the will of a majority of the people.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because we talk about once in a generation. I'm going to bring in Meg Kelly now, who's a politics student at Glasgow University. Good morning to you, Meg.
Good morning.
Good morning. You weren't old enough to vote in the 2014 referendum, is that right?
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
But you would be if in a forthcoming one. And you would vote yes?
Yes, 100%.
Yeah. So when we talk about this, once in a generation, I suppose there are always generations coming up. And in just 7 years, you have become someone who is eligible to vote in an independence referendum. And we know that, support for yes leans towards a younger generation. So what would you say to Sheila?
Yeah, I get that obviously that was the kind of what was put out in the 2014 referendum, but definitely I think, as Sheila had said, and you said, that there has been so much change that argument kind of doesn't really make sense anymore. We've went through a global pandemic, we've left the EU, and obviously if we would have another referendum this year and the result was to be no, I think that the kind of look on that result would be very different in years to come, because I sure hope that there won't be kind of as much change as there has been in the past couple of years in the years to come. So I think that one of the main reasons why the SNP are looking for that referendum quite quickly since the last one is just because that there are so many young people that don't agree with kind of how the last referendum played out, and they want to have their say, and also a lot of people who would maybe vote differently now due to kind of everything that's changed in the past couple of years.
So you would like to see another referendum, hopefully by the end of 2023. If that was to be held and the result was no, would you then say, Meg, right, OK, that's it, we need to put it to bed for a generation, for a significant amount of time? Or would it be, as Sheila fears, OK, let it lie for a few years and then bring it up again?
It's difficult because obviously, as coming from somebody who wants independence, I of course would love another opportunity to then get it. But at the same time, we do have to understand the nature of democracy, and if we've had 2 no votes in quite a short amount of time, then that does then seem to be the will of the people, and I'm sure the SNP and the Scottish Government as a whole would understand that. I think it would then just be in terms of the things that we were promised, etc., in the 2014 referendum. Like, for instance, one of the ones was, if you vote yes, that means a ticket out of the EU, when in reality we've seen that we voted no, and we're still out of the EU, which is quite a big, a circumstantial change. So I think it would be if the vote was a no at the end of next year, we wouldn't be able to have another referendum unless there was such a big shift in circumstances that it seemed that the kind of previous vote then became invalid. So that could be.
But then you can't ever preclude that, isn't it? I mean, you know, coming out of Europe is what Nicola Sturgeon would describe as a material change. You know, none of us can preclude the prospect that we would have another referendum, and then there would be another material change because, of course, you know, we have no power to know what lies ahead. None of us, well, I was going to say none of us saw that pandemic coming. I'm sure there's some people say, well, yes, we did, and we didn't do anything about it. But you know what I mean. We don't really know what's coming down the track. So if you go with that logic, then you could say, well, I don't know, maybe we have a referendum every 7 years just to check that everyone is okay with it. 08085 92 95 00 is the number to call. I will speak to Christine Jardine, Liberal Democrat MP for Edinburgh West after this. We are talking about an interview that the First Minister Nicola Sturgeon gave to the BBC yesterday, a restatement really of her intention to hold a second independence referendum by the end of 2023. Preparatory measures are in place, she says, though of course at the moment the way things stand constitutionally, it is down to the office of the UK Prime Minister to approve a further referendum, a second referendum, and at the moment it doesn't appear that office, I'm having to be vague now, is in a mind to do that. Christine Jardine is the Liberal Democrat MP for Edinburgh West. Good morning to you, Christine.
Good morning.
Good morning. Interesting speaking to Meg here, who's a politics student at Glasgow University, who wasn't old enough to vote in the last referendum, but would be now, and would be keen to vote yes. And as a young person would say, you know, I want to have my say. You know, this Scottish Government was elected with a commitment to have a second independence referendum, full square centre of their manifesto. So much has changed in those 7 years, and therefore, as a matter of democracy, we must have a second vote. Would you accept that?
I respect completely everyone's need, desire and right to have a say on our future. And I think for every person who wasn't old enough to vote in 2014 who would vote yes, there will be somebody who would vote no. But I think what we have at the moment...
We know that the polling goes more in favour of young people voting yes.
What we have at the moment is polling which is split 50-50, but more important than any of that, Kaye, is what we have at the moment is a country which is in the middle still of a crisis. Not just a pandemic, but we have a cost of living crisis now. We have rocketing energy prices. And that is what all of us, whether we are in Holyrood or Westminster, that's what all of us should be focusing on. Because there can be a material change in two ways. There can be a material change which makes it, better to discuss the issue, or there can be a material change which makes it the wrong time to discuss the issue. And I would say that at the moment, this is the wrong time. I have no problem with people talking about it, but we have to talk about it at the right time, and this is not it.
OK, well, let me bring Meg back in. Meg, how would you respond to that?
I mean, I completely understand what she's saying, of course, but I think in my eyes, in terms of what's going on right now with the pandemic and the cost of living crisis, that they kind of go hand in hand. I think a lot of the view of a lot of Scottish people, in terms of the reason why a majority voted for SNP, is that they believe that these issues would be dealt better by an independent Scotland, and well, personally by the SNP, but of course an independent Scotland doesn't mean the SNP have to stay in government. But I think for a lot of people, we would see that these issues need 100% need to be dealt with first and foremost. But I think the best way that we can have the best advantage of tackling these is to be independent and have control of our own country and make our own decisions, and then we can therefore prioritise that these issues be sorted.
Christine?
Well, I appreciate what Meg's saying, but you see, for me, my country does have control because I'm British. So, I believe that we should devolve power to communities for control, and I think the Scottish Parliament has the appropriate control at the moment for the issues that it's appropriate to deal with at that level. But macroeconomics, the situation we're in at the moment, demands a wider platform, a wider canvas, if you like. And I would also say that what we don't want at the moment, regardless of whether Scotland were to vote yes or no, if we were to go through the referendum, we all saw the upset it cost before, the money that it caused, the dislocation. It would take years to deliver. And in the meantime, we would still have the economic crisis. But on top of that, we would have economic dislocation. We've all seen what's happened with Brexit. We've all seen the dislocation that it's caused. Scottish independence would do exactly the same. Now, it's only 7 years since we've talked about it, and I appreciate what she's saying about so many people now being able to vote. But let's just wait until we have a calm period, until we can actually see the future, we can see what's going to happen, and then, by all means, discuss it. I have no problem any time with discussing whether it's what we want or not. But I just think at the moment we have to make sure that we get through this winter, that people don't have to make the choice of, do they feed their children or do they keep the house warm?
Okay.
That's my priority.
OK. Bob's in Clydebank. Good morning, Bob.
Good morning.
Do we wait for a calm period?
Well, we're listening to her tomorrow never comes sort of style when you listen to that conversation for the last point. I mean, every government, no matter where they are, actually faces ups and downs sort of style. Now, originally, I voted for to stay part of the United Kingdom, and the reason I did was because we were told then that if we left United Kingdom, we would be out the common market. Now, I'm pro-market. I believe it's a good thing. Not so much for myself, but for my grandchildren. I think the benefits for them far outweighed anything else. Now, lo and behold, we're out the common market. It was already in the cards. So we actually voted on what I would say was a lie. And I don't want... There's nobody will convince me any different. I think it was also in the pot before.
So it's flipped you from no to yes, has it?
What do you want to yes? Now, the simple fact...
OK, hang on, Bob. I'm just going to bring in David and Cumbernauld because I'm just watching the clock as well, trying to get as many views in as possible, because I think you're in the same boat, David. Is that right? You were no, now yes?
That's absolutely right, Kaye, but it's probably for different reasons. I mean, what I see is a government that we never elected, really, imposing itself on us with values that we just don't recognise as Scottish people. The situation is that in perpetuity...
But you could argue that was the same situation in 2014, David, when you voted no. We had a Conservative government, which Scotland didn't vote for.
No, I get that, Kaye, but the road has diverted so far away from that now that I'm almost feeling as though we're in a war situation here. Our politicians, our people are demeaned by politicians and people in authority. We've got someone who would be better in the Pickwick Papers and Rees-Mogg and intruding into my life. And I cannot understand why... I don't care who governs the country. I'm not an SNP head. We need to get independence for the values that we hold as Scottish people. And then the Labour Party, the Conservative Party, the SNP need to bring forward a portfolio of proposals that will swing the country after we get independent. This isn't independence to get the SNP in. This is independence to get away from that shambles which is happening down south and impinging on our lives.
Sally, morning to you.
Good morning.
Good morning. How would you respond to David there? We need to get away from what he calls a shambles that's happening at Westminster.
Well, I don't think, Boris is probably going out the door. I don't think just because, Boris, Nicola Sturgeon can keep pointing out that he's a buffoon, that's a reason for independence. We might get a Labour government, a competent Labour government, and there wouldn't be any reason for it. This morning, John Swinney said that it was too early to say that it was the beginning of the end of the pandemic, and suggested that face coverings and working at home would continue indefinitely. Is that saying maybe he didn't listen to Nicola Sturgeon yesterday, saying that she was getting on with preparations for independence? And as far as the pandemic, I am a firm believer against independence, and the pandemic has reinforced my feelings. Where would all the money come from, to pay for the furlough scheme? And also, it was in Oxford that the vaccine was developed.
Yeah, well, certainly the AstraZeneca vaccine, of course, other vaccines developed around the world as well. But Sally, thank you very much indeed. Thanks to everyone. Thanks to Christine Jardine there and Meg Kelly. We'll come back to it, no doubt.